We wanted to start today with a really important conversation on covering violence against transgender and non-binary people. We wanted to give credit to where credit is due, so we wanted to give a shout out to Corey Rose, a second-year Berkeley journalism student, who suggested the idea for this panel. Last year, Corey, yes, let's give Corey a little round of applause here. Thank you, Corey. Last year, Corey organized a panel for the journalism school called Here, Black, and Queer, New Visions for Covering the Black, Non-Binary, and Transgender Communities. And to bring it all full circle today, Corey's panel actually inspired some of the reporting that will be featured on this panel. So here to moderate this panel is Kate Sosin. Kate is the LGBTQ+ reporter at The 19th, a nonprofit newsroom covering the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. They focus on transgender rights, incarceration, politics, and public policy. Kate has conducted deep dive investigations into transgender prison abuse and homicides for NBC News, and they have previously worked at Logo TV and Windy City Times. Kate, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. What a great panel we have here today. I'm so pumped to be here and to talk about a topic that pretty much everyone in this room has told me is going to be deeply depressing. On October 12, 1998, Matthew Shepard succumbed to injuries that he suffered after what many consider to be a heinous anti-gay hate crime, and most of us remember his name. About 6 weeks later, a woman by the name of Rita Shepard was stabbed more than 20 times in her Boston apartment. She was a Black transgender woman, and I would venture to guess that most of us have never heard her name. Following her murder, transgender women decided that they were fed up and tired of being killed, of losing their friends and family, and started making lists of trans homicide victims. And those lists were eventually adopted by LGBTQ advocacy groups. Those lists eventually started making it into news media coverage. And we see them still today. In 2017, we hit kind of a breaking point with those lists when GLAAD, the media advocacy organization, said we need to stop reporting the deadliest year for transgender people because they rob trans people of their humanity. What GLAAD did not foresee is that over the next few years, we would see this huge surge of anti-transgender legislation. And in fact, we would have what we know now are the deadliest years for transgender people. Historically, when we talk about trans homicides, we think of them as simple hate crimes or acts of anti-trans discrimination, and that's the way they've been reported on. I'm super excited to present to you two projects that push beyond those really simple narratives. And the question that both of these ask is, how do you investigate structural violence and discrimination when you don't have something that's as simple as, one bad guy or a serial killer, but you actually have an entire deep system where at every turn people are discriminated against because of their gender and their race. So I'm so excited to present these two projects to you. I'm gonna ask our panelists to get deep into them and explain to you what they did, how they did it, why they did it. Because I think a lot of times in investigative reporting, we sometimes pick what is simple and not nuanced, and these are deeply, deeply nuanced and difficult. And so I'm so excited to present our panel today. Nia Decaille has worked as a reporter and audience editor for the last 6 years. Nia started her career in journalism at the Washington Post in 2017, where she started tracking homicide cases involving trans victims. Her passion for connecting readers with in-depth reporting continues at her work at the New York Times. She is currently an audience editor specializing in SEO. Esther Kaplan is a veteran journalist, an investigations editor at Insider, as a newsroom leader at Reveal for the Center for Investigative Reporting and Type Investigations. She oversaw projects that led to criminal indictments, congressional hearings, federal investigations, and legislation. Investigative projects she's overseen have been recognized with the Emmy, National Magazine Award, Peabody, DuPont Scripps Howard Award, and Investigative Reporters and Editors Medal, among other honors. She was previously an editor at The Nation, Pause, The Village, Voice, and a radio host for WBAI. Her writing on labor, politics, and social movements has appeared in Harper's, The Nation, and other outlets. She's an author of With God on Their Side, about the Christian right's involvement in national politics. And finally, we have Rayna Momen, who's a PhD and program coordinator and instructor for higher education in the Prison Initiative at West Virginia University, where they recently earned their doctorate in sociology with an emphasis in crime. Their dissertation centered on the criminalization of transgender people using a queer criminological and intersectional lens, which, by the way, is really new and rare and awesome. Momen is a Black trans poet, queer criminologist, and abolitionist. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited. We're going to start off with Rayna, who's going to take us through the data for the Insider piece that they worked on.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm a panelist at this symposium today, as you know, for my role as an editorial consultant as part of Insider's investigations team, which resulted in the most comprehensive database of transgender homicides to date, covering the 5-year period 2017 to 2021. So Insider collected thousands of pages of documents. They spoke with friends, family, communities across the country to uncover stories of people killed by partners, parents, dates, clients, and police officers. So I want to begin by noting some data findings that were featured at the top of Insider's interactive report called Deaths in the Family. Of the 175 cases included in the homicide database, only 3 were charged as hate crimes. Only 28 homicide cases resulted in murder convictions, and more than a third of the cases remain unsolved. So these stark findings suggest bias occurring in all levels of the criminal legal system, from the investigative process through the prosecutorial stages. In the 5-year period covered, transgender homicides doubled between 2019 and 2021. And as mentioned earlier, this coincides with the significant rise in anti-transgender bills proposed and passed throughout the country, alongside the residual effects of the anti-Trump administration, as more people remain emboldened to incite violence against members of the most marginalized groups. Black trans women represented more than 63% of victims in Insider's database, indicating gender-based and racialized violence is at play. Latinx women were the second most victimized, followed by white women. 85% of all victims were of color. 8% were trans men, and 5% were gender nonconforming. Of the 129 suspects identified across cases, 88% were men, 70% of which were men of color, with over half of those being Black men. Another striking finding from the analysis is that intimate violence stood out among transgender homicides. Of the many decisions that needed made with regard to refining definitions, Insider chose intimate violence as a variable to include dates, hookups, clients, and housemates. Homicides in these contexts represented the largest percentage of known circumstances of death, followed by sex work on the job, domestic violence, and transphobia in cases where evidence of a clear motive was obtained. There appears to be a racial component at play in terms of case outcomes as well. Insider found when victims were Black transgender people, their cases were more likely to go unsolved, whereas murder convictions were more likely to result in cases with white transgender victims. Again, this suggests bias throughout the criminal legal system. Despite the reality that racism, sexism, and transphobia, among other intersections, are at play in many transgender homicides, whether overt or covert, just one case in 5 years resulted in a hate crime conviction, and in all too many cases, charges are never brought, they're dropped, or suspects are convicted of lesser crimes. Insider also noted important regional variations in the data, with homicide rates the highest in southern states, which also warrants further exploration. Of these top 5, Louisiana, Missouri, Mississippi, Maryland, and South Carolina, all but Maryland had recently passed anti-transgender laws. Importantly, too, many of these homicides took place in rural or unincorporated areas. As with larger society, gun violence featured in the majority of homicide cases. 72% of victims were killed by guns, followed by stabbings, blunt force trauma, and strangulation. Insider also found that more than a quarter of these homicides were considered overkill, defined as a level of violence beyond what is necessary to end someone's life. Most of the identified suspects were young men. 30% were ages 22 to 29. A quarter were under the age of 22, and a quarter were 30 to 39. More than 55% of suspects that were identified in these homicide cases were under the age of 30. And while suspects were very young, so were most of the homicide victims, with 44% aged 22 to 29 when they died, and another 14% under the age of 22 at death. Over 58% of victims were under age 30, while 29% were aged 30 to 39 when their lives were taken. Wrapping up the data piece, I wanted to just share a quote that's included in one of the stories that Insider published that came out of this work in terms of one step toward curbing this epidemic of violence. When people are knowledgeable about transgender lives, when they understand the limitations of the gender binary and the fact that it is a social construction, when they better understand the extent to which transgender people are impeded from safely inhabiting and navigating the social world, they are much less likely to harbor irrational fears about trans people and are less likely to incite violence against them.
And now we're going to turn to Nia, who's going to talk us through this incredible investigation, which focuses in on Louisiana, which is where, for years now, we've seen the highest rate of trans homicides.
Yeah. So good morning, everyone. So I have to first start off by saying, like, those numbers are startling and actually coincides with a lot of what I was finding when I started this project. I am one person of a team of 4 incredible women that helped me put this project together. I started this in 2018. I just kept noticing that, you know, every day I was on Twitter or I had seen a new story published about the death of a transgender woman. And I think the question I kept asking was, like, why is this happening? How could somewhere like the Post, that has a lot of resources, that's looked into homicides before, that's looked into violence of this nature, how could we look into that? How could we get closer to what's happening? A lot of the coverage that I was reading at the time, and I want to give credit to ProPublica. They did an amazing story in 2018 about these 4 women in Jacksonville, Florida. One of them survived, but 3 of them had been lost to gun violence, about dead naming and how that complicates the process of finding justice in these cases. So there was some good reporting out there, but I really thought that trying to look at this what felt like an epidemic as a whole, and trying to understand what is a lot of this like connective tissue. So it started with a spreadsheet and just collecting these cases. And I was just like talking with Esther about this, is you know, having a column for the name that they were, you know, assigned at birth, and talking to police departments, and having to, like, you know, give their former name, and tracking down what city. And so this is like a 2-year process. But that was kind of how it started, was just like a spreadsheet, and just being very curious about like what is going on, and why is this happening so frequently? Why am I waking up every day and there's someone else who's passed away? And reading the coverage, which I found was really fascinating, you would see, you know, a daily story kind of laying out what happened, and then a quote from the HRC or an activist organization that would basically say, you know, these women are often experience higher rates of violence. And I just kept thinking, like, but why is this happening? And how can we add nuance to that conversation? And how do we kind of illuminate their experience? So that's kind of how this project started.
And I want to ask to pull just one fact out of this that I think is critical. In some ways, and this is just from the piece that I'm going to pull out, in some ways the killing of trans women are like the killings of cisgender women. A post-analysis in 2018 of 4,484 killings of women in 47 major U.S. cities of the previous decade found that nearly half, 46%, had died at the hands of an intimate partner. But studies show that transgender people experience dramatically higher rates of intimate partner violence when compared with non-transgender people.
The more that we looked into it, and Sam, who was a big part of this project, Sam Smith, who at the time was covering these issues at the Post, and who I had kind of pulled in to kind of say, you know, I have 100 or so cases. There is a story here. Can you help me verify a lot of these cases that have a lot of twists and turns in them and that are very complicated? Can you help me like tell this story? And one of the key themes that came out of, and Rayna, as you kind of highlighted in your data as well, intimate partner violence. But when you're reading the coverage about what happened to this person, it almost seems like, oh, this sounds like a hate crime. It wasn't prosecuted as one, but it reads like a hate crime. And then you dive into these cases and you see, oh, this person had prior contact with the suspect, with the person that killed them, more than one time. And so I think in our spreadsheet at one point we created a column for how, you know, did they have contact with this person? Did they know this person? And that became like a key element, that these killings were not random, that these women knew who killed them. And further underlines this point about, like, I think in a lot of ways challenges how we think about bias-motivated crime and hate crimes.
Esther, I want to jump to you. Can you talk me through some of the data that we've just seen and contextualize it for us in terms of this huge investigation you edited?
First of all, please read Nia's story. It's so beautiful. I had read it when we were working on the project, but I reread it the other day, and it's so human and beautiful. And if you get anything out of this panel today, dear room full of journalists, is to put Dr. Rayna Momen in your Rolodex, brilliant criminologist, who I excitedly now get to refer to as Dr. Momen. But yeah, I wanted to dig in kind of behind some of the data that Rayna just presented and talk about how much transphobia we came across everywhere we tossed a stone. I don't have to tell everyone here that we were not successful at getting full investigative files from police departments in all of these cases, but we were able to get them in a lot of cases, actually, and got like a front row seat to how these cases were investigated. And it was pretty shocking. I'm going to start with it took me 1 minute to pull together these examples because there were hundreds of them. But just to give you a sense of how police are treating trans victims of violence. So here's one Baton Rouge Police Department incident report, completely typical, referring to the victim by their assigned name at birth, which is something no one in the community knew them by, and referring to her as a transvestite. On the right is just a sample. We read all the local spot news coverage of all of these cases. I'm sure you did this as well. Yeah. Totally typical article. Here is a quote from the local police department. The fact that we have a man in women's clothing, said veteran Houston Police Department Homicide Unit Detective Phil Waters, the speculation is he's been working the street, that someone picks him up and realizes he's not what he's representing himself to be and take this kind of ultimate action. I mean, there's so much wrong with that statement. But then this is what goes out, and this is the beginning of the investigation. Misgendering, transphobic assumptions. Rayna, maybe you can go to the next slide. So again, typical coroner's reports using the wrong gendered body to show the injuries. The bit on the right is from a witness interview in a domestic violence killing in Louisiana. The victim was named J.Lo McGlory, a young, vibrant woman. So this is a neighbor who was present when the killing happened, and throughout the interrogation, you see again and again this cop trying to make her talk about J.Lo as a man. And the bit I have here is he says, let's talk about the use of it in reference to a person. It's a man, and she kind of answers, and he just refers to himself as a woman, and then you see an answer below where she's trying to say the girl, and then she corrects herself to say guy because that's what the officer is trying to get her to say. And as the interview keeps going, she eventually just in frustration says, I'm just going to call her she, okay? But the officer wouldn't let it go. And we saw this kind of thing again and again where even when witnesses are trying to talk about how someone is in the world, the officer will not let them properly gender the victim. And the J.Lo McGlory case is kind of incredible because Kate just brought up that there are these parallels that you uncovered between cis women and trans women in terms of just the dominance of domestic violence in homicides. But what we found is prosecutors and juries and judges could not recognize these as domestic violence relationships. So J.Lo, even by the prosecutor, is gendered as male in the courtroom. We got the investigative files and could clearly see a classic DV story, right? You can see on social media, we have tranche of social media, falling in love, da-da-da, then there start being these posts of why do I always end up in a violent relationship? He gonna kill me? You can see the drumbeat of the violence increasing, and then it turns fatal. In court, it was treated as if it was a single incident of transactional sex. J.Lo, the victim, is masculinized and framed as a threatening figure, and her killer is acquitted. And just the inability to recognize what was clearly obvious in the evidence, that this is a domestic relationship, they lived together, they had a romantic relationship, they had a sexual relationship, and it was increasingly violent and became lethal. And it results in an acquittal because there's no ability to recognize it. We saw it at the level of judges. So we looked at a case in San Antonio. My colleague Nicole Einbinder looked at this case. Sorry, Hannah Beckler and Michelle Mark are the reporters on the JLo case. Nicole Einbinder digs into this case in San Antonio of another young black trans woman. She's out on a date, and the man she's with pushes her into the river, and when she's very drunk, and she drowns. And this was the one sit down we got with the judge, and the judge literally said to our reporter, well, the killer in this case was also acquitted because it was seen as reasonable that he had, after they'd been making out all night, that he rebuffed her touch and responded with lethal violence. This was somehow seen as reasonable by the judge. And he literally said in the interview, well, if she'd been a petite, like a real woman and petite and small, then maybe, it would have been different. And just the way that we see again and again trans women, particularly I would say trans women of color, masculinized, treated as aggressors by prosecutors, juries, judges. So the more we dug into this, the more we were seeing anti-trans bias at every stage of how these cases were treated in the criminal justice system. Right,
emerging
the
theme.
Good news panel. Yeah.
Emerging theme. These stories are obviously, they're deeply complicated, and one thing that I think is really complicated that I really want to dive into, Nia, with your piece, is the main subject. Mm-hmm. I want you to talk about Decaille as the centerpiece for this, and a difficult, maybe editorial decision to include her. Can you tell us a little bit about who she is and the tough editorial call that you had to make in terms of learning her history and a conversation that you had internally?
Absolutely. Decaille, who we ended up kind of focusing the story on, and just to zoom back a little bit, we thought this was going to be 3 different stories because there were a few themes that arose, one of them being intimate partner violence, also family relations, and I think Decaille's story really encapsulated all of those different themes and threads that we kept seeing about transgender women, specifically Black women, and the challenges that they're up against. And Decaille, who also passed last year, Sam goes down to Baton Rouge to do this reporting before she's very forthcoming about her experience. And so Sam flies down there, and for a lot of the reporting trip, she's hard to get a hold of. She's kind of, ghosting. So that's another thing about what made this project kind of difficult is, in a lot of ways, we also chose to focus on a victim who was alive, right? And just to kind of be able to paint this picture of what these women are currently experiencing, how they're surviving, after being able to kind of speak with her, we also, we did request some documents. We knew that she had served jail time, but we were able to confirm that it was in the death of another trans woman that she was convicted of manslaughter. So that complicates the narrative of how we see transgender people, transgender women. We're reading about them as victims of violence, but they're also trapped in this cycle of violence, where they can not only be the person experiencing the violence, but also a perpetrator of that violence because of various reasons. For Decaille, it was over, work. This woman named Passion, they got into, a squabble, and, that woman ended up dying. So I think it just complicated the narrative, and I think added a lot of nuance. This was definitely an internal conversation about, like, should we focus on this person who was also guilty of harming a trans person, and ultimately I think it was just being able to provide readers with a sense of, like, these people are human. And also this idea that people who are marginalized, we should provide them sympathy when they're the perfect victim, but there is, in investigating a lot of these cases, there is no perfect victim. These people are human. And so that just, it complicated the narrative in a lot of ways, and we thought, it would lead to a lot of, like, interesting discussions about violence and the cycle of violence that these women are trapped in. I mean, in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge specifically, there are not only very few resources for these women, but they're discriminated against when it comes to housing. They're already up against, like, a pay disparity compared to their white peers. And so, and are kind of forced into sex work, right? Which, of course, there are laws against that as well. So if you are caught up, like, in that cycle and you don't have a means of, like, providing for yourself, it's just this constant cycle that you're kind of trapped in. So Delasia was, I think, helped illuminate a lot of those experiences and a lot of the common threads that we found through the reporting.
I just want to pipe in on the perfect victim. The one hate crimes conviction in our entire 5-year database was a white teenage girl, and that was killed, and I don't think that's a coincidence.
I also just wanted to give a quick Monica Roberts, who, and when I started this project, I had, to your point, Kate, just about the lists that were being published about these cases. Monica Roberts at the Transgrio I leaned so much on her reporting. She is really the foundation of this project, and helped me stay on top of all of these cases of women that were dying across the country. And the thing about Monica is that she was fast. Of course, the bar of just, like, journalistic integrity, really, in terms of following up on these cases. I think we lost just a huge resource in tracking because, I mean, I found her to be even more accurate and helpful than the HRC's numbers, just because her ear was so close to the ground. So I also wanted to give credit to the late Monica Roberts, who, that database is just incredible. If you have the chance to read the Transgrio, please do, because it informed so much of my reporting on this.
Yeah, for context, Monica Roberts was a Black transgender woman and blogger who I think many of us considered to be an early trans journalist and probably one of the first people to chronicle these homicides starting in 2006. She passed away in 2020. I want to turn to you, Rayna, as a consultant on this project. I think for many of us in this area, seeing you from the trans community being brought in on this project is heartening and exciting. And there's so much nuance in this investigation, and I have to guess that it comes back to you, and I have so many questions about that. I want to ask, what are some of the challenges you faced? And then a piece of that is, there are pieces in this that go against the style guidelines of, like, GLAAD and TJA, but ring so powerful and work, right? They feel respectful. And I want to ask you about some of the editorial choices that you made, and especially with using people's former names and pronouns, and how you all decided to work through that as a team.
Those are really important questions, and I appreciate you asking, and I'm sure Esther can also certainly give some insight. And I also want to give a shout out to Diamond Stiles, the other editorial consultant on this project, who just was phenomenal and just was unable to be present with us today. You know, the decisions were all definitely made as a team, and it was a pretty good many of us that were getting together. You know, you mentioned going against some of the style guides, and I would love for you to maybe point out an example or two, but really what it came down to is all of us really talking about the best way forward and making sure that we were maintaining dignity and humanizing these individuals as victims of fatal violence and as human beings who, you know, were doing things with their lives before they were taken so soon. I'm trying to think of some, you know, some examples, but like my role really, I think the challenge above all else for me and my experience with this project, I had been working on putting together my own comprehensive database of transgender homicides for 4 or 5 years prior. When I went back to school in 2016 for my doctorate, I dove in headfirst to this challenging topic. So I had gathered about 9 years of data, and I had been immersing myself in that research and that data and this, you know, a similar type of project, but doing it alone for so long, it's daunting, it's depressing, it's difficult. So the biggest challenges were knowing when to take some time to step away before giving some insight or consulting and whatnot, because it's very hard. And then as a person who identifies as non-binary and transgender, I'm a member of the communities that I'm watching, you know, die in these very brutal deaths. One particular area that stands out in terms of some of the insight I offered was the notion that so many of these homicides were just particularly brutal crimes. So I brought in that kind of element of overkill in that concept and asking if the team would be willing to explore you know, how that plays out in these 175 cases, and to learn that over a quarter of them would qualify as something so brutal is another, you know, thing that stands out in these particular cases. I hope I'm answering the question or the couple of questions that you asked, and please feel free to bring it back to any of those that I might not have touched on.
Yeah, that's a really helpful answer. Thank you. I also
Rayna undersells herself, as always. That's Rayna's style. But I actually want to just add to that, because I feel like there were some taxonomical decisions that Rayna was really pivotal on. And we've talked a little about one, the federal definition of what domestic violence is was not squaring with what we were seeing. And that was an ongoing conversation with Rayna and with Diamond over a period of months about, you know, and ultimately we decided that we were going to tally things that fit that federal DV definition, but also tally the broader world of intimate violence that would include hookups and client relationships and other forms of intimacy. And if we'd only done the DV, it would have been just 18 cases out of our database. But with this broader definition that we workshopped, it became 39, which is a more accurate sense of what we were seeing. And the other really interesting conversation was about, we began by thinking about how many of these are hate crimes, and we actually ended up abandoning that term. I mean, we looked at hate crimes prosecutions, but we shifted, and this was really Rayna's intellectual work, to this framework, and Diamond, to this framework of transphobic violence. Because what we were seeing was that the cases where transphobia was documentably present, which of course many other cases, and structural transphobia is present in almost all the cases, but it was someone who'd been sexually intimate with a trans woman and then feared discovery, or panicked about what it said about them, sending text messages, I'm feeling suicidal, et cetera, or were discovered and after discovery lashed out. And so what we kind of re-inscribed the idea, instead of tracking and investigating hate crimes, it was transphobic violence, by which we meant people responding to a cultural wall of transphobia. And when you look at it that way, it is extremely clear what the connection is between the ferocious anti-trans rhetoric that we are facing right now, that has become really the battering ram of one of our major political parties, and a mixed up 18-year-old, 20-year-old young man who is feeling such explosive shame for having been intimate with a trans woman that he reacts lethally. It is not hate in the classic sense. These young men, they were intimate with these women. They do not hate these women. It's a response to the culture. And that 180 that we did was really because we had Diamond and Rayna in the conversation, and we're looking at what we were seeing and coming up with a way to really see it and describe it. And it was one of the biggest kind of turning points in our thinking about the whole project. So,
I also want to point out, you investigated some cases where we seemingly knew what had happened or it had been reported, right? Like you dug into Club Q, right? Yeah. Can you talk about the decision to do that and what you found?
About Club Q?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was not part of the original package. We had kind of a rollout plan that was over about 8 weeks to roll out the series, and it was smack in the middle of that Club Q happened, which kind of threw us back on our heels. But yeah, one of our reporters happened to be from Colorado, and we just sent her out there to talk to people in the aftermath, and yeah, had some really moving conversations with members of the trans community there. But yeah, then I mean, she kind of stitched together like a lot of information that was starting to filter out from the previous court case involving the alleged perpetrator, and yeah, I mean, found that it was, I mean, and this is sort of like a body of work we should all be reporting more on, but just the way in which transphobia is a player in online radicalization right now. It's like in the mix with white nationalism, with replacement theory, with all of that, and misogyny, but transphobia is in there, and that part of this kid's, like, you can kind of trace his radicalization and his exposure, like kind of through white supremacy into anti-trans violence. And yeah, that was kind of a chilling thing to really see. I think there was one expert that was describing transphobia as almost like a gateway drug at this point to online extremism.
One of the questions that I have for really all of our panelists, you know, I think when we look at the way that trans people are portrayed in mainstream media, it's generally not great. And I have this hesitancy with my own reporting as a trans person reporting on trans lives a lot of the time is, I have a question about what to expect from people in this world, about how much they should already know about trans people. So when I approach a Department of Corrections, for example, or police, or anyone, I'm uncomfortable with knowing how much grace to give people. And one of the things that I love about these two investigations is you really draw a hard line on the dignity and humanity of trans lives, and say this is what people deserve. They should be treated with respect. They should be honored in the genders that they are and that they live. And I'm wondering if at any point you had difficult conversations about how to hold people accountable, who to hold accountable, and when to call people out versus honoring the lives of the victims and survivors in these pieces.
Yeah. I think throughout the process, like I kind of mentioned before, us having to create a column with a victim's name, the name that they were assigned at birth, and I would be on the phone with a prosecutor, I'd be on the phone with a PIO, and I think in some ways after, a lot of calling a lot of these places, and because this is a lot of painstaking reporting, I chose my moments. So, for example, I'm on the phone with the prosecutor, and I'm like, I'm looking into the case of so-and-so, of Decaille White, of Quisha Harding, and they're like, who? We don't have that person in the system. We don't know who that is. They might also be listed as X. And so, but also like, but this is the name that they refer to themselves as. So, it's difficult, and I had to choose those moments of when I would push back, of when I would, or just like, mention that this is the name that this person referred to themselves as. But just in terms of trying to get the information to make sure that we are speaking about the same person that died, right? I think sometimes I had to have a little bit of a concession, which is, it's nuts, right? But on their end, it's like, well, we don't even have, I typed their name into the system, I don't have that file. And so having to, to say, okay, in order to get this information, in order to look into this person's life, in order to eventually honor this person's life or do the best reporting possible, I have to make that concession. So there were moments, but I think in the reporting, Sam and Brittany and Ice, we were all on the same page about what the goal was, which was to highlight these challenges that Black transgender women are up against. And so I think we always operated with that, like offering that dignity, and making sure that was present throughout, whether it was sourcing, how we refer to victims, all of that. I think we were all on the same page about, having a story that, told this very, emotional tale about, this woman who is grieving the loss of her friend, is in a toxic relationship, a toxic and very violent relationship with a man who is also I think ashamed of dating a transgender woman. So this very complex tale, but also again, coming back to this place of we all agree that this person is human and we're here to tell the most truthful, fair, and accurate story possible. But it was difficult, it was very difficult to interact with law enforcement about this. And being on the same, just basic understanding of that we are on the same page, that we're talking about the same person, very difficult. Throughout.
Rayna, can you weigh in on how you advise the team on this?
I would say I was definitely less involved when they were doing the outreach in terms of the FOIAs and the, getting the source information. But, we certainly had conversations in terms of the best way forward in complicated situations where maybe you have different sources using different pronouns and multiple different ones for the same individual, and figuring out how do you decide if you don't have anything accurate information on how does that person self-identify, and now that we're talking about a person after death. So some of those conversations were had, and there wasn't really a clear-cut way to address that, whether you're saying, well, more often than not, these pronouns are being used, and you're at least looking at by the loved ones or the chosen family and whatnot, and the people that, had the most respect for them in life. But so my role was much heavier in terms of taking the data that they had collected and being able to make sense of it, and look for patterns and look for things that people have not looked at before, and see what story is really there to tell.
I think the piece about the family is also really important, which also made it very complicated. It's like I was, looking into one of the very many cases in Florida, and I was speaking with the PIO about this, and it wasn't like a back and forth, but I guess it devolved into a back and forth because the officer was basically saying, well, the family does not refer to the victim as transgender. And I don't, whatever story you're writing, that would not be accurate. But all of the news clippings that we found, we also relied really heavily on local news, which I think the first, instance of a lot of these homicides we found in local news clippings, and it seemed that this person was transgender, and so it's this thing with like the family not acknowledging. I think that was the case with Decaille as well. Her mother, who she was living with, just did not acknowledge or accept, called Decaille by, the name that they gave her, so it makes it difficult when the family also, the only surviving people to kind of speak to this person didn't really acknowledge or even really know them in some cases. So that also made it difficult.
Esther, your team also ran into that in a pretty serious way. Can you talk about that and the decision that you made?
Yeah, actually, Rayna, can you put up the photo of Tiffany at the police station? This is another case that my colleague Nicole Einbinder dug into. This is Tiffany Pugh sitting at the Pritchard, Alabama police station outside of Mobile, as she does almost every week. In the 2.5 years since her 17-year-old child was killed at a crowded party in front of multiple witnesses, this remains an unsolved case. The newly elected Mobile County DA is now, thanks to our reporting, reopening the case, which is great. But so this is one of our most complicated cases, and Diamond and Rayna and Nicole and I had many conversations about how to gender this child. She was 17. Her mom knew her as a flamboyant gay boy named Jahim. Her chosen family, who have all since fully transitioned, knew her as Bella. Her mother obviously completely devoted to her, but the photos on her T-shirt of her child are photos from her child presenting as male. And the state of Alabama had a horrible, legal decision that means you basically cannot get law enforcement records in the state anymore. So, Tiffany was an incredible ally, right? She, tried to help as next of kin, help us get records. She was, introducing us in the community. She was critical to the story, but in the end, after a lot of debate, and Rayna can weigh in on this, we just felt like when Tiffany spoke about her child, we were going to quote her fully, and she gendered her child how she did in her own words. But in our narration of the story, we were going to use she, her, and that was really hard for Tiffany, really hard. There was some radio silence for a while once we kind of broke that to her. But, I would say Diamond especially, but Rayna too, it was this reporting is for the community. This is not for the family specifically, and that is the imprint we have to make. But we knew it would be, painful for this woman who's been conducting this unrelenting quest for justice. And so, yes, it's extremely, we were commiserating about this before, it's extremely emotional and complicated to navigate this stuff.
And I also wanted to say really quick, I think also, one of the things that I think, when Sam went to Baton Rouge to do this reporting is, even in talking with Decaille would refer to herself as gay. and not transgender. So that also, you know, other than like, you know, the mother that doesn't acknowledge it, I think the other thing is the language that, you know, Decaille was even using to refer to herself. And so it is complicated. It is very, very, very complicated. And I think on one hand, we absolutely wanted to get it right in terms of, you know, how this person identified, how they move through the world, but also just realizing that, you know, Black trans women are experiencing so much, and so much of it is survival, and some piece of it wasn't just the language and getting the language, you know, absolutely correct. It was like, how do we honor this person? How do we tell the most truthful and fair story? So I also thought that was interesting that Decaille even referred to herself as gay and not transgender.
I want to open it up now for questions from you all. Down here. I think there's a microphone coming to you. Yeah, you have to be mic'd for Rayna to hear you. So.
Okay, thanks. Amazing panel. Thank you all so much. There was talk about some of the similarities and a bit of the differences between intimate violence for cis women and intimate violence for trans women or trans people. And also just right now, a sort of link between gay people or gay and lesbian people and trans people. I'd like to sort of hear the panel talk about what they saw as the similarities that cis women or gay people face, that trans people have, and even more interesting, maybe the differences in this kind of violence that the trans community is facing. I'd like to sort of get into that texture.
I'd be happy to quickly chime in and certainly hear from the other panelists, but my first thing is just the overwhelming dissimilarity. What's strikingly different is, you know, we don't, as a society, we don't have the expectation that cisgender people are required and expected to disclose their sexual orientation or gender identity in any given situation, place, and time to complete strangers or people they know, but we have that expectation for trans people. This notion of disclosure stands out. And then when we're talking about some of the intimate violence, especially when it's in relation to, in the context of sexual violence and fatal violence, you know, trans people are literally being murdered, oftentimes after an encounter or some form of intimacy for reasons of shame and whatnot on the part of the suspect or the killer. But cisgender people are, generally speaking, not subject to that level of violence solely because they have an intimate encounter with another human being that's consensual in most of these cases. So I will leave it at that and certainly hear from others. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Great question.
I just also, something that I was unaware of until we did this reporting, many women's DV shelters will not accept trans women. A very large number. There was a national survey. I don't have the data point in my head, but that's, so both, as I said earlier, the ability to get justice in court, but also the ability to get services.
Hi. I'm right over here. Hi. First of all, thank you so much for such an incredible panel. My name is Jess Alvarenga, and I used to be an associate producer for Translash, audio show hosted by Amara Jones, which is this incredible, brilliant journalist, Black trans woman. And so I learned a lot from her. And my question is more about the future of reporting on trans people and what that can look like. As a non-binary person myself, it's like a little bit challenging to see people, my community, my chosen family, to like constantly be victims of like being brutally killed, as like Dr. Rayna Momen just mentioned. And so I'm wondering how we can continue to expose violence against trans and non-binary people while also covering the joy and love and like just the complicated lives that we exist in. And the second part of my question is, how can we just be seen as normal people? Like, how can we be investigated as normal people? Like, we can also commit tax fraud. We can also do really complicated things, very problematic things. And we can also be victims of structural violence that doesn't, it intersects with our gender, but it's not the main subject of our lives. So just want to hear the panel about that.
Yeah, this is a part of the reason why I think Delasia's story is so important, because I think, you know, her life does, again, kind of complicate the narrative about who we think transgender women are, who they're allowed to be, and I think I would love to see more reporting around that. I also think sourcing. This was something that I raised throughout the process and all of my many conversations with Sam, as she, was reporting in Baton Rouge, and even before that, is like, how can we just, are there people of this community that we can include in the story? How can we make, transgender people who are gender nonconforming, who are of this community, how can they be sources and not just the subject of the story? And that's something even after, reading this story and after it published, I was just thinking to myself, how can we incorporate more of these people as sources? Because they're the experts, right? They've lived and experienced this. And I think another really important point too is, I think, especially when you're talking about Black transgender women, it's something that just marginalized people in general are kind of up against. I think working in journalism, it's been interesting because I think one of the things that Black people especially feel in mainstream news is that always this idea that we have to, because we've experienced reporting that doesn't necessarily speak to the nuance, the challenges that we're up against historically, I think there's just a part of just feeling like, when are we going to be seen as human? When are we going to be seen as not just victims? I think it's a larger question that, especially when we're talking about Black transgender women, that is that we're still. It's a challenge. It's still a challenge. It's still a challenge to be seen as human. So
Can I jump in here? Because I have a very strong opinion.
I was going to ask you to.
Look, so I'm a trans reporter, and I think one of the very few transgender reporters who are employed full-time in a newsroom in this country doing hard news. The Transgender Journalists Association is more than 600 members. If you don't have a trans reporter working in your newsroom, you need one. And I would challenge everyone in this room to go back to your newsroom and make that argument. We need trans reporters in newsrooms, especially in this moment. There's a national crisis in terms of not just reporting, but transgender lives and humanity. And the only way that's going to change in terms of the stories that we tell, both in terms of humanity, trans joy, reporting on trans people as full people, is to get trans people in newsrooms. There are incredible reporters out there who are trans, who are ready for your newsrooms, and they need jobs. So please, go to your newsrooms. If you want them, come talk to me. I will send them your way. I think we have time for one more.
I just have to briefly endorse that and just say the whole reason this project at Insider happened is because two trans journalists at Insider started, Quispe Lopez and Madison Hall. Quispe's now at them, but it will transform your coverage. So yes, listen to Kate.
Yeah, Esther, you mentioned how trans women are often shut out from women's shelters, and I was wondering if what other lines of investigative inquiry there might be for other, philanthropic interventions, public health interventions that we know to be evidence-based that you think might be fruitful. What do we know about whether money is being dedicated to this in a proportionate way, and to the extent that it's being discriminatory against trans women?
I actually think that, when every newsroom represented in here hires their army of trans reporters, we will discover what a rich, I just think there's so much incredible reporting to do here. Nia was bringing up marginalization before, but there's so many pinch points that all could be investigated, right? Trans kids are more likely to drop out of school because of the intensity of the bullying, intolerable bullying. So then that puts you out into the world without an education. That's a whole world, what's happening in our schools, right? Trans people are 3 times more likely to be living in poverty, 4 times more likely to be unemployed. At each one of these places, there's an investigation that you could do, right? And certainly in terms of public services, victim services in the crime context, but also DV services, access to health services. One of the things that Diamond, who is Diamond Styles, one of the consultants on this project, and also the head of Black Trans Women, Inc., says is there is a fetishization of trans death, and that she gets phone calls and she even gets donations sparked by trans death, but when she's trying to raise money she has a fund that supports trans women to afford surgery, to a food pantry for trans women. She has all these other projects that are nearly unfundable, right? And so I think there's a lot there for us to think about as journalists about what we consider newsworthy in reporting on the community.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to this incredible panel.